Peace, everyone. Welcome to the Baruti Libre show. And I am Baruti Libre Kafele. And what we're going to speak about on the Baruti Libre show is Dr. Martin Luther King, the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and his dream within the 21st century. I repeat, Dr. Martin Luther King, the legacy of his dream within the 21st century. Now, contrary to popular belief, Dr. Martin Luther King was not just a man with a dream. He was a leader on a mission. Dr. Martin Luther King was not just a man with a dream. He was a leader on a mission. Born on January the 15th in Atlanta, Georgia, January the 15th of 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Martin Luther King was born to Martin Luther King Sr. and also Alberta King. And he grew up in a very religious and conservative household. And also, additionally speaking, he grew up in a household where education was the priority. And he grew up in a household where excelling was a priority, if you will. Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. was a pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. eventually became the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And also, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a very meritorious person, even during his young ages or even during the rudimentary stages of his life. At the age of 15, Dr. Martin Luther King graduated from high school. Typically and usually, people graduate from high school at the age of 18, but he graduated at the age of 15 years old. And then additionally speaking, he received his bachelor's degree from Morehouse College, received his another bachelor's degree in divinity from Crozer Theological Seminary, and then received his doctorate degree from Boston College. But with his degrees, he didn't just use his degrees for individual gratification for the purpose of mobilizing up the social stratification system. He utilized his degrees for the purpose of struggling for his people, for the purpose of changing laws, for the purpose of reforming society, because you have to understand, we are a manifestation of the institutions that we live in, and we are a manifestation of the times that we live in, or the era that we live in. And Dr. Martin Luther King was born during a time of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is basically a name or terminology to explain the policy of separate but equal, institutional separation, or institutional segregation, if you will. I wouldn't say separation, I would say institutional segregation, if you will, based on the legislation that was passed in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. And I'm going to get into that probably in another video because I want to stay congruent as it relates to Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was born during those times in the South. And of course, within the southern regions, you're dealing with people that are very abhorrent, people that are very mischievous, and also you're dealing with people that are very angry and resentful due to the fact that, of course, the southern states were seceded and they formed the Confederate States of America, and that's what catalyzed to the Civil War, which was a generation before. And of course, after the ending of the Civil War, of course, you had the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which basically naturalized people of African descent and gave black people citizenship, even though there was still a huge climate of racism. And also during that time, there was still a whole lot of racism. There was a lot of disenfranchisement going on, a whole lot of police brutality going on, a whole lot of vigilante terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan antagonizing black people going on. All of this was going on around the time of Dr. Martin Luther King's embryonic stages as a child going into adulthood. So with him observing these things or these occurrences going on in the South, he felt that it was his obligation in order to rectify a lot of the problems that were going on within the society. So going into December of 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, you had a young, ambitious, and perturbable young lady by the name of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks sat on the front of the bus, and of course with segregation based on the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, it's the segregation of all public facilities, meaning that white people had to go in one area and so-called colored people had to resort to another area. Separate water fountains, separate schools, separate lines, separate places on the buses, if you will. So Rosa Parks sat on the front of the bus, and then when the officers addressed her and demanded that she sit in the back, she refused, and that led to her arrest. And this received national attention to the point in which it got the attention of a young and ambitious Reverend, college graduate, and activist, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So what he did was organize, and he met with the activists within that area, migrated to the Deep South, the antebellum South, Montgomery, Alabama, and he led a bus boycott from 1955 to 1956-57, to the point in which you had the passing of the Browder versus Gale decision, in which buses were desegregated. Public transportation in Alabama was desegregated, if you will, meaning that black people could sit wherever they wanted to sit on the bus. Now, that was Dr. Martin Luther King and the activists. That was their achievement by boycotting the buses. But he did not stop there, of course. He went to Albany, Georgia, to desegregate, if you will, because throughout the South and also throughout the country, but mainly in the South, you had the intensity of racism, the intensity of brutality of people of African descent. You had that intensified to a whole nother level because, of course, with the South, that was where you had the Confederate States of America because, of course, the Civil War was based on the secession of the South, if you will, so that they could form their own country because they were against the public sector interfering into their affairs because you had an industrialized North, and then, of course, you had an agrarian South. And the agrarian South was ran on cotton. And who worked the cotton fields? People of African descent involuntarily. And that's where you had the slavery or the involuntary servitude system. And slavery still perpetuates to this day, and it definitely was perennial during the times of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., if you will. A lot of the racism, a lot of the discrimination and all that. So he went to Albany, Georgia. Not only that, he went to Birmingham in order to protest. And that was over there in which he was incarcerated for a lot of the activism, if you will. But he was continuously incarcerated. But the reason why this was notable, because he wrote the famous letter from the Birmingham jail. Letter from the Birmingham jail, if you will, speaking about a lot of the racism, a lot of the inequality, a lot of the inequities, a lot of the issues, a lot of the hypocrisy of white moderates who weren't bold enough to speak about the racism, to speak about the inequality, to speak about a whole bunch of the institutional paradoxes, if you will, that was occurring within society. So the thing is that in 1963, of course, he gave the I Have a Dream speech in which he dreamed of universal suffrage for humanity, and he dreamed of a day in which the posterity of the nation or the progeny of this nation will become in a much better state. They can outside of race or they can outside of one's phenotypical traits, but they can instead or judge someone based on their character or based on what they could bring to society, which could benefit the greater good, if you will. But then also, he achieved a whole bunch of other things. We could get into 1965, of course, and during Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, of course, where you had protesters and activists who were crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge or attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to bring about awareness to the point at which they were addressing a lot of the disenfranchisement with the voting that was going on. So, of course, with that being a very calamitous, a very malicious, and of course a very egregious situation with black people being brutalized and black people getting attacked with water hoses and a whole bunch of other things, this was syndicated nationally. So this caught the attention of Dr. Martin Luther King again, and what he did was mobilize various activists to go into that region, Alabama again, Selma, Alabama, and then from there cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge again, and then eventually you had the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But then again, a year before, you had the passing of the Civil Rights Act based on the protesting, based on the enlightening, and also the self-determination which was going on amongst people of African descent to make sure that they obtained their rights. So, and that was when Dr. Martin Luther King was in Florida protesting, mobilizing the people, organizing the people. So wherever he went, he wanted to make sure that he brought about changes and reform within the society in which he inhabited at the time. So you had the passing of the Voting Rights Act, the passing of the Civil Rights Act, and of course, you had the desegregation of public transportation. So what Dr. Martin Luther King eventually did was he wanted to intensify his struggle and take it to a whole nother level. He began to migrate up to the north. He went to Chicago in 1966. And in 1966, what he wanted to do was protest against the racial steering that was going on. Because of course, you know, with the industrialization that was going on up in the north, you had a lot of southern migrations up to the north because people of African descent wanted to escape from a lot of the atrocities that were going on within the southern region of the country. So, of course, you had segregation going on with the housing. So what he wanted to do was fight against that. So he was over there against that, and then from there, he was emphatically against the United States intervention into the war in Indochina. He was emphatically against that because from his logic, he was basically saying, why are we going over to Indochina in order to democratize that area? Well, we're not even practicing democracy domestically in the United States of America. Black people aren't even treated equally within the United States of America. So why are we going to try to superimpose liberty, justice, equality, and democracy to another area thousands of miles away when it's not even getting implemented within the confines of this country? So he was against that, and he was against imperialism because the ulterior motive a lot of the time for militarism in another country or in another region is imperialism. And imperialism is one country or one civilization or companies from another civilization capitalizing on the natural resources within a whole nother area. Now that's going into macroeconomics, if you will. So of course he was against that, and of course undeniably he was against racism as well. So Dr. King wasn't just a person with a dream, he was a man on a mission. going into 1968 towards his unfortunate assassination and his early assassination at the age of 39 on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, he was in solidarity with the sanitation workers, if you will, because they were against the low wages. So not only was he a man with a dream, he was against the economic injustices and economic inequalities that was prevalent within society as well. Now, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King was for universal suffrage and also economic empowerment for black people, which a lot of people don't know. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was for black self-determination. Towards the end of his life, of course he was for integration, but he was for black empowerment as well, and he started to become vocal about it within his various speeches. If you were to search on YouTube and the various other websites, you'll be able to notice that he was also for black empowerment, black economic empowerment, and also black wealth distribution. And also, he was for the compensation of people of African descent or black people, because a lot of the atrocities that were inflicted upon them from involuntary servitude or slavery, and also the discrimination that was prevalent and also contemporaneous during that time. So he was for reparations, if you will. A lot of people don't even know that. So let me explain this. Now, to bring it to 2016, Dr. Martin Luther King, are we living this dream or are we living this nightmare? Well, of course, we had a whole lot of progress, and we have a whole lot of progress, if you will, but then again, it depends on how you define progress. We have black people that having the opportunities to enter into the so-called free marketplace so that they could be able to create businesses and become wealthy and also provide jobs for their community and also a whole lot of other people. And contemporaneously speaking, you still have black people that are suffering from police brutality with the assassination of Walter Scott, the assassination of Sandra Bland, the assassination of Sean Bell, the assassination of Mike Brown. So even though Dr. King was a person with a dream, the fulfillment of that dream is still not 100% complete, because we have a long way to go. We have ways to go, and we need to make a whole lot of changes even within the society. And also, additionally, as a society, Dr. King's assassination is also a controversy in and of itself, because in 1999, the United States government was complicit in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because, of course, you have the COINTEL program, which was, of course, created by J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, and also he worked for a bureau called the Bureau of Investigation before it became the FBI in 1936, if you will. He worked for the FBI and also created the COINTEL program, which was based on disrupting, destroying, and also instigating conflicts within black movements, if you will, black progressive movements, because of course you had the politicization of the black population, especially the younger population, and also within that file, they spoke about alleviating the chances or the probability of a messianic black figure to arise, like a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, like a Malcolm X, like a Stokely Carmichael, or like Elijah Muhammad. You could look it up right on the internet. So, of course, we have a lot of things to change, and we have a long way to go, because not only do we have intergroup discrimination or intergroup violence or homicides that still occur, additionally, we also have intragroup discrimination. Intragroup discrimination is the internal violence which is prevalent within our community, because according to statistics in 2013, 90% of the homicides that occur within the black community is from another black person. 90% of the homicides that occur within the black community is from another black person. Now, of course, the numbers are high for other ethnicities. Within the Caucasian population, it's around 83% or so, 82 or 83%. But then again, it's still larger and staggering within the black community, meaning that if we're going to be the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream, or if this generation is going to be the representation of Dr. Martin Luther King's dream, then of course we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and be the change that we want to be in the world. Now, as far as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there's some people that may be against Dr. Martin Luther King because with his philosophy, he was for civil disobedience, which was influenced by people like Henry Thoreau, Gandhi, and various other philosophers who we study. But then again, no matter if you're for nonviolent resistance, no matter if you're for just internal development, no matter if you're a nationalist or you're assimilationist or integrationist, if you will, Dr. King's dream still has not been fulfilled, because we could all still find commonalities within King's dream, which was for the end of racism, militarism, imperialism, economic injustice, and a whole array of other problems within the society. So in the meantime, if we're going to represent Dr. Martin Luther King properly, and also to bring about his legacy so that his dream could fully be fulfilled for the betterment of us as a people, we need to learn, we need to read, we need to become enlightened, we need to become the men and women that we should be. We need to alleviate a lot of these problems by judging people just based on their phenotypical traits and judge people based on their character, based on their ethics. based on what they could bring to the table as far as making the society a better place. So in the meantime, these are just some points for you to think about and to cogitate on, and hopefully I motivated you to study Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So this is an episode of the Baruti Libre Show, and be on the lookout for more. Peace and love.